before I heard about this particular festival, I'd never heard the term polymath before. So I thought, well, let's look up the term, find out what it means, and maybe find some examples of polymaths, individual examples. So I looked in, some of them have already been mentioned: Da Vinci, St. Hildegard, Einstein, Picasso. And I noticed something about these. They all have some creative aspect to it. They've done something very, very creative. So I thought, well, let me look at the creative literature in psychology, literature on creativity in psychology, and see what it has to say. So creativity has been a topic that's been very, very big in psychology for many, many years. It's gotten even bigger recently due to the technology we have in neuroscience, where we can take brain scans through fMRI studies, do non-invasive research. We don't have to pop open your head and actually look at your brain. But prior to this, a lot of the information we got in neuroscience was due to people who suffered from severe brain injury. We would look at what happened to them afterwards, what capabilities they had before and what capabilities they had afterwards. And we were able to see what areas of the brain were damaged and how they correspond to those particular lost functions. Now, as Dr. Sanders mentioned, I have a little story about some dynamite and a brain and a big metal rod. So one of the first neuroscience patients where we started discovering individual functions of the brain was a man named Phineas Gage. Here's a picture of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage lived in the 1840s, so the mid-19th century. Phineas was a railroad construction crew foreman. So it was his job to kind of supervise a construction crew, but he had a very special job on this construction crew. If you look at what he's holding in his hands, it's a metal rod. It's about 3 feet 7 inches in length, weighs about 13¼ pounds. So it's a sizable rod. What he would do with this rod is he would take the rod and he would tamp explosive powder into holes that had been drilled into rock so they could loosen the rock and hence build the railroad. Well, one day, actually, September 13th, 1848, whilst poor Phineas Gage is working on the railroad, he's tamping down the dynamite, and all of a sudden it detonates. Kaboom! Well, that rod, again, 3 feet, 7 inches, 13¼ pounds, does this to poor Phineas Gage. Now, keep in mind, this is 1848. It goes through his left cheek, right behind his eye, and all 3 feet, 7 inches, 13¼ pounds, did I mention? Out through the top of his head. Well, it takes with it part of his brain. And the interesting thing is he survives. Out in the middle of nowhere, some country doctor patches him up, and he lives. He lives for about another 11 years afterwards. But Phineas Gage has changed. Prior to the accident, he's a very industrious person, considered a rather shrewd businessman, made plans for the future, good abstract thought process. After this accident, though, after that prefrontal lobe disappears, or is shot out through his head, rather, he becomes quite surly. He's unable to focus his attention, cursed profusely, and lost his ability for abstract thinking. So he completely changes, all because this little area of his brain gets blown out. Now let me show you where that is on this map. Okay, whoops. Sorry if I shine this in somebody's eye. Okay, the area is right in here. It's part of the frontal lobe. And let me go through just a little description of this part of the brain. What we're looking at now is what we call the cerebral cortex. So cortex is basically just the word for bark. So we're talking about the outer coating of the brain. And this is where a lot of our higher functioning takes place. So we've got 4 major lobes. We've got the parietal lobe over here. Oops, sorry. That's the parietal lobe. That's associated with somatosensory information. So we're taking in information about touch, Temperature of the room is processed there. Some visual information is processed. The next one's the temporal lobe down here. That's where a lot of our auditory information takes place. Also down at the very bottom of the temporal lobe, that's where we process faces. So when you're looking at a face, that area of your brain is lighting up. And then the back part right here, this is the occipital lobe. So this is where all of our sensory information is being processed. We're taking that in, it goes to this area of the brain and is processed. The frontal lobe, though, takes that processed information and starts messing around with it. And this is where we have, this is where our higher order thinking takes place. So, and this is the area of Gage's brain that is gone. So what takes place in the frontal lobe? Well, this is where we take in that sensory information, and one of the first things we do is we come up with a concept of ourselves. I'm an individual, I have a body, I'm James. Or you. Self-reflective consciousness. We can sit there and we can think about our actions. Abstract thinking. So a key component to creativity, to being a polymath, is that abstract thinking ability. Cognitive flexibility, taking in information, manipulating the information, coming up with something new. Dr. Weber talked about dialectical thinking. That's where this would take place. Theory of mind, that aspect of consciousness where I think I'm thinking about what you're thinking right now. I'm able to take your perspective. And also two other areas, two main features: working memory, where I'm taking in new information, combining it with older information, and manipulating it. So I'm, in a sense, creating something. This is what's happening in the working memory. Also, sustained and directed attention, the ability to focus on the task at hand. Now, Phineas Gage gave us a good insight to this, because when this part of his brain was destroyed, all of these abilities were gone. He was unable to do this anymore. And I got thinking about this as I was looking through this, and I got looking at that definition of a polymath, and I thought, you know what? Every one of us has the hardware to be a polymath. It's already structured in our heads. And I got thinking where I'm at. Well, I'm at a nice liberal arts university. It's like, I'm at a polymath nursery, you know? And so I got thinking to my students, you know, you've got all you need in your heads right now to be a polymath. You're at an institution that supports that, so you'll be a polymath. That's it.